Hey everybody, JCB here with the Awesomest, and you're watching the Awesomest technology. So in part 1 of this series, I discussed the many iterations of interim technology in the home video market. But more importantly, I explained the difference between the natural evolution of technology and those weird in-between technologies that we'll be discussing in this video. If you haven't seen part 1, I strongly suggest clicking here and giving it a watch, as you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about. In a nutshell, we'll be discussing the gadgets and gizmos that came in between the major generations. Usually they offered a new twist on the standard of the time and gave consumers a glimpse of what was to come. A perfect example of this is the first item on my list, the ZipDrive. The Iomega ZipDrive was a medium capacity storage device for the PC and Mac. In 1994, when the ZipDrive and ZipDisk were released, the standard floppy disk held 1.4 megabytes of data. To put that into perspective, the average song in MP3 form is about 4 megabytes. That means you would need to take that one song and split it up across 4 floppy disks if you wanted to share it with a friend. I know technically MP3s wouldn't exist until July of the following year and wouldn't really explode until a few years later, but you get my point. In 1994, there was virtually no way to back up or copy large chunks of data. Tape drives have been around for a while, but they're extremely slow, noisy, and not very reliable. Remember, CD burners weren't widely available yet. In September of 1995, Hewlett-Packard introduced the 4020i, which at $995 was the first burner to cost less than $1,000. It would be a few more years before the price dropped low enough to be widely adopted. So in 1994, the ZipDisk made its debut, and for the first time, home users could copy and transport large chunks of data on a diskette. The first incarnation of the ZipDisk offered 100 megabytes of storage. You would need 77 floppy disks to store that same amount of data. Later, ZipDisk would introduce 250 and 750 megabyte versions. I know numbers like 100 megabytes and 750 megabytes seem silly today, but that was a big deal at the time. In fact, this technology was so important that the manufacturer Iomega was the subject of one of the first technology bubbles on Wall Street. People poured millions of dollars into Iomega when this technology first became available, expecting the company to grow by leaps and bounds. Eventually, though, the bubble burst, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. That's how important this technology was. Zip drives were offered in both internal and external variations. The copy process took a little while and made a high-pitched noise as it copied files. If you would like to see one in action or want more information about the zip drive, there are videos from Gear Diary and the Practitioner in the description below. The zip drive carved out a nice little market share and was the only way to copy and transport large amounts of data for a while. However, as I mentioned before, the rise of the CD burner coincided almost perfectly with the rise of MP3s and the creation of Napster. This perfect storm of potential piracy, along with the CD's ability to store 700 megabytes of data, created a huge demand for CD burners, and the zip drive started to lose ground. But in the interim, the familiarity of using floppy disks coupled with the relatively high capacity for storage made the zip drive a nice stepping stone between the age of floppy disks and the age of the CDR. Now let's change gears a little bit and talk about audio. Specifically, my next piece of interim technology, the MP3 CD. Similar to the VCD, there was no physical change to the CD medium itself, just the way it was used. MP3 CDs were in fact just regular CDRs, but instead of only holding 20 or so individual audio tracks like a normal CD, MP3 CDs were full of MP3 data files. In other words, you put a bunch of MP3 files on a CDR just like you would put them on a thumb drive today. Audio CDs have been around since the 1980s, and their shortcomings were well known. First, they scratch easily. Second, the more music you have, the more physical storage space you need. And third, every little tap or bump makes a CD skip. And I don't care how good you claim your so-called disk stabilizing technology is, Mr. Discman, my CDs still skipped every time I ran over a kid. MP3 CDs set out to solve this problem. Since all the files were digital, entire playlists could be buffered into the CD player's memory, thus reducing the need to read from the disk and eliminating the possibility of song skipping. The fact that approximately 175 MP3s could fit on a single CD made storage a lot simpler, as a band's entire discography can now fit on a single CD. Those bulky CD binders became a thing of the past and are now mostly used for video games or DVDs. As for scratching, well, they still scratched, and that's why CDs are basically plastic coasters at this point. Still, for a few years there, the MP3 CD was a solid solution to problems that had plagued CDs since the very beginning. Many car stereos produced today still support MP3 CDs, which shows just how handy this technology was. While we're on the subject of audio, let's discuss a topic many of us have not even thought about in a while: ringtones. Specifically, polyphonic ringtones. In the early days of cell phones, ringtones were completely monophonic. That is to say, there was one line of notes. When a person whistles, they whistle monophonically. You can't whistle more than one note at a time. That's how ringtones worked. In addition to their simplicity, every phone had a handful of ringtone options. This meant that every time someone in a room received a call, everybody checked to see if it was their phone. Over time, cell phones got a little more advanced, and the great new innovation was polyphonic ringtones. These were essentially MIDI files. In fact, most of them were MIDI files. The other format was MMF, but MIDI was far more popular, mainly because MIDI had been around for years and there was a lot of software available for composing MIDI files. When most people think of MIDI, they're reminded of the annoying auto-playing background music of early websites. But MIDI is basically a sequencing format, and is still used by major studios today for electronic drums and other triggers. Suddenly your favorite song could be your ringtone. It was like the clouds opened up, Beethoven himself descended from the sky and kissed humanity on the head. It was awesome. But then cell phone makers realized, hey, we could just add MP3 capabilities, and just like that, the polyphonic ringtone was essentially dead. So we all know what happened next. For some reason, cell phone manufacturers decided that MP3 ringtones could only be a few seconds long, which means you had to either edit down your own MP3s or you had to buy an MP3 ringtone, usually for like twice as much as the entire song would cost you. This is still mostly true today. We also saw the rise of songs in popular culture that seemed like they were written for the sole purpose of being sold as ringtones, and that was pretty annoying. Polyphonic ringtones had a few short, glorious years in which they improved upon what had become a dry, boring ringtone experience, but it was still clearly coming from your phone and not from some stereo nearby. Today it seems we've come full circle with people just settling for the default ringtones that come with their phone, which means once again we're back to the point where everybody checks their phone anytime someone gets a call. If you'd like to avoid that problem and you want to know how to make your own ringtone from an MP3 file, I have a link to a video I made for Android phones, as well as a link to an instructional video for iPhones in the description below. Another piece of interim technology I wanted to bring up is something I'm calling email by phone or voice email. Many of you probably don't know what I'm talking about, but this is a fairly common service in the late 90s. And a Google search pulled up this old Angelfire site of somebody else talking about how cool one of these services was. So I know I'm not crazy. This actually existed and it was cool. Email by phone was a mixture between voicemail, which had been around for a while, and email, which had just exploded onto the scene. To understand just how cool this was at the time, you have to go back to the 1990s when email was brand new. You have to remember that Windows 95, the first truly user-friendly widespread version of Windows, came out in 1996, and that by 1997-98, the masses were just now finally getting online. The internet was exploding like California during the gold rush. Free web-based services like Hotmail and Yahoo had just barely come online. Suddenly anybody could obtain a free throwaway email address, and obtain them we did. Nowadays, checking and maintaining my email is a chore, but back then it was a rare occurrence to even get an email. So it was exciting every time you did, and this made you want to send emails to your friends. For the first time in human history, we had instant communication that allowed us to show each other pictures and other kinds of files. It was really neat. Instead of just being on the phone and hearing someone's voice, you could send them a photo, you could send them a diagram or a drawing of something you were talking about. People became obsessed with checking their email, but you couldn't yet bring the internet with you. So services like MyTalk and Infinity Email offered a service in which when you signed up for an email account, you also got access to a 1-800 number. You can call this 1-800 number, input your PIN, and a computer would read your email to you over the phone. This was amazing at the time. I can't find any screenshots of the old MyTalk website, so I was super happy to find that Angelfire page because it confirmed that this actually existed and it was actually cool. It wasn't something I just made up in my head. These services existed during the dot-com bubble of the late 90s, so they came and went pretty quickly. One day you'd be on a payphone listening to a computer read you your email, and the next day you'd get a message saying the service was shutting down. But you didn't really care because you'd just move on to the next site offering the same service. Eventually all these services would disappear, as would any indication that they ever existed for some reason. But in its heyday, this service was pretty cool. It allowed you to check your email from work or school. All you needed was a phone, and back then those things were everywhere. One such service still exists, aptly called email to phone, but requires a paid monthly subscription. Picking up a payphone and listening to your email was a weird middle step between the desktop and the smartphone. While I'm still on this subject, does anybody out there remember using a service like mytalk.com, or does anybody out there know any more information about it? I'm very interested in these weird little things that happened for a couple years and then disappeared. The final piece of interim technology I'd like to discuss in this video is the instant camera. Polaroid was well known for manufacturing instant cameras like the Polaroid One Step. These instant cameras were point and shoot, super simple to use, and spit out a printed photo moments after it was taken. Until now, photographers would have to shoot an entire roll of film, then have the photos developed before they could see the pictures they had taken. You wouldn't know if you made a mistake with one of your photos until you got the developed photos back. This meant you didn't have the ability to notice or correct a mistake. By the time you saw any problems, the moment had long passed. This meant honing your skills as a photographer took a very, very long time, and every mistake was not just a waste of money developing the photos, but a waste of time and a waste of opportunity. Would-be world-changing photos were probably tossed in the bin because of exposure and focus errors made by photographers. Remember, there was no LCD screen to show you what your photo was going to look like before or after you took it, so instant cameras were a great way to hone your skills as a photographer. The film was a little more expensive, but ultimately you would use less because you would learn from your mistakes at a much faster pace. For the first time in human history, we could see what our photos looked like moments after taking them, and that instant gratification was kind of addictive. Long gone were the days of a group photo being ruined by the one person who happened to blink at the exact moment the picture was taken, 2 months ago. But eventually the instant camera would be replaced by digital cameras, which allow for the same type of instant gratification and real-world photography experience without the need to buy expensive instant film. Instant cameras were the perfect half step between the past and the future. You still ended up with a printed physical photo, but it did it in a way that was new and exciting and fun. Also, once people got used to having that moment with their friends where they could look at the photo together, there was no stopping the march towards digital cameras. Gone but not forgotten, the instant camera is a beloved stepping stone in between the film and digital worlds. So that does it for part 2 of this series of interim technology. If I missed anything you're expecting me to talk about, make sure you leave a comment down below. If I get enough submissions, I can do a part 4 of this series. In the meantime, part 3 is on its way, and in that video I'll be talking exclusively about pieces of interim technology that were completely replaced by smartphones. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, keep being awesome.